Good morning. Getting everything situated up here. If you routinely take part in the Sunday morning programs here at First Unitarian Society by joining us here in person, you likely already know this. But if you visit us primarily online, you may simply have to take my word for it. But our building here in Minneapolis is located in something of a valley of churches. If you look out the window over here, you can certainly see the huge, beautiful dome of the Catholic Basilica of St. Mary. If you leave the building this morning and head east on Douglas, you'll see that you're driving directly at the steeple of Hennepin United Methodist Church. If you kind of veer a little bit to the left to go over to the traffic light, and look a little bit further to your left, you'll see the squarish tower of St. Mark's Episcopal Cathedral. If you were to go through the light, very shortly you will arrive at Plymouth Congregational. On the other hand, if you make a right, just a little ways down, you'll pass the Christian Scientists on the right, and just before the construction begins, you will see Temple Israel at 24th. And here we are, nestled in among all the rest of them, in our own buzzing hive of heresy. Okay. I'm done now. Now, as committed heretics, it may occur to you that we really have very little in common with these other congregations, but I think that's not really entirely true. I've lived here in Minnesota now for about 27 years. And I've been in most of those other buildings at some point or another, maybe for a concert, some other kind of a performance, event, perhaps a memorial. And in many ways, we really do have a number of things in common. There are clergy people, there are songs, there are dedicated times to gather, weddings, funerals, other rituals, and the like. One of the things you may think that we don't share in common with any of these folks is they all seem to have what's called a liturgical calendar. This is, of course, a schedule that will play out over the course, typically of a year, and will mark certain important events in the life of that congregation. It might be Saint So-and-so's Day, or it might commemorate an event that occurred centuries or even millennia ago. Such a calendar is deployed to connect the congregants with an overarching narrative, an origin story, ideas which help inform the character of the community which gathers there, and indeed sustains that community. And you may think, well, that's all well and good for them, but here at First Unitarian Society, we would never think of having a liturgical calendar. It's preposterous. But with all due respect, I think, in effect, we do have such a calendar. It looks a little different than theirs, perhaps, but there are definitely some similarities that we've explored on occasion. Our liturgical calendar really is the cycle of the seasons. These are important days in our calendar, and as many of you know, here at FUS, we make a particular effort to recognize these special days, like the equinoxes and solstices. These are the milestones that we mark as the year unfolds. We return to them each year, and it's a source of comfort to know that we have this very predictable cycle playing out in the backdrop of all our lives, one that we'll be able to turn to rely on, and to look forward to. It's a cycle that many of us invest with a sense of meaning and connection with something far, far larger than ourselves. Our choice to affirm our links to this cycle does sustain this community and speaks to the character of this congregation. I strongly suspect that if we asked some of our more churchy neighbors what their liturgical calendars mean to them, they might say many of the same things. One of the things that we also do here at FUS is we mark an additional day within this cycle, one which is called Lammas. Lammas is one of 4 days referred to as cross-quarter days. These are the halfway points between a solstice and an equinox. Lammas is one that's kind of fallen out of popular awareness, while the other 3 we know well, but usually by other names. Halloween and May Day, for instance, are modern versions of cross-quarter days known to others as Samhain and Beltane, respectively. Earlier this year, for a little bit of an experiment, we marked another one, which we usually think of as Groundhog's Day, but which in the past has gone by other names, such as Candlemas and Imbolc. Lammas, of course, is the fourth, and it falls between the summer solstice and the fall equinox. While many of these events are connected to the agricultural cycle, Lammas brings us to the beginning of the harvest season, in particular, the harvesting of the first grains. It has historically been marked with celebrations that focus on grain, especially wheat, and from there on bread or other uses for grain. Part of our annual Lammas tradition is preparing fresh bread on site, which we invite everyone to share downstairs after assembly. It's truly the closest thing we'll ever come to communion in this building. Heretics don't normally do that sort of thing. Some of our amazing volunteers are down in the kitchen right now, producing that delicious bread, which you may be able to smell already. And one of them will come up later this morning and tell us a few more details about what we can look forward to. The idea of wheat and harvest has been on my mind a lot this past year or so here at FUS, but for a rather different reason, maybe an unexpected reason, and yet one that is literally staring me in the face. And is something that each of you in the building is experiencing today as well. But first, being a history major, a little background. This building here on Mount Curve is this congregation's second permanent home. You may know that our first permanent home was built in the late 19th century over around 8th and LaSalle, right by the old Dayton's department store. The slide on the screen is a photo of that building. If you'd like to take a closer look at it, this photo is hanging on the wall in the library down at the end of the hall. And for a bit more tactile connection, stop over in the Dietrich room next door and check out the original cornerstone, now embedded in the wall just inside the doorway. The cornerstone indicates the building was completed in 1887, a mere 6 years after a group of leftists known as the Liberal League, I think we would have gotten along rather well, invited a Wisconsin Unitarian minister, the Reverend Henry Martin Simmons, to address them on the subject of evolution, which then, as now, created a lot of excitement among religious conservatives. They liked him so much, they created a congregation to keep him here, and thus FUS was born. Our origin story. Or, not exactly. If you look at that actual cornerstone, it refers, in fact, to the first Unitarian church. Yes, the C word. Which at least now creates a lot of excitement among religious liberals. Now me, I love old buildings, and I so wish I could travel back in time and really explore this first Unitarian. Barring that, I'm dependent on photos and on what its contemporaries had to say. In October 1891, only a few years after the building was built, Harper's New Monthly magazine ran a feature on architecture in Minneapolis, written by columnist Montgomery Schuyler. This article included a review of our own building. Schuyler started out in his description of the place like this. A Unitarian church in Minneapolis is also an unconventional specimen of church architecture, though it could not be taken for anything but a church. Of course not, look at the cornerstone. And it is undeniably a vigorous performance, consisting of massive, well-divided and well-punched walls in a monochrome of dark red sandstone. Doesn't that sound impressive? Well, of course it does. Unfortunately, Montgomery had a few other things to say, which I'm paraphrasing because Montgomery is obviously a hack journalist unfamiliar with 21st century English. The novelty and the unconventionality, however, seem, both in composition and detail, to have been contrived, and the effect is marred by the loss of naturalness and straightforwardness. Oh, Montgomery. Really. It gets worse. He writes, the innovation in the treatment of detail in sandstone, which is left rough-faced, is a caprice that seems also to proceed from the pursuit of novelty, one that gains nothing in vigor for what it loses in refinement. Slovenliness is not vigor. You know, I never liked Montgomery. And it still burns after 130 years. Still, he made at least some effort to get on my good side by noting, for all that, there is much felicity in the general disposition and in the design of the features, especially in the open fenestration of the transept gable, by which the verbose Montgomery Schuyler is simply trying to say there was a big window near the ceiling. At least he liked that. He would have been thrilled, perhaps, when the building was eventually torn down when the city widened the streets around 100 years ago, or so. And for several decades, FUS was somewhat rootless. Yes, we had offices over near Loring Park, but as far as an assembly space like this, our predecessors turned to movie theaters. These were often quite available on Sunday mornings, as most, if not all, theater owners declined to show movies at that time of the week. And so we, like others, held services in theaters downtown. In the late 1930s, our congregation bought this property. Ask resident historian Wendy Jerome sometime about the shenanigans behind that transaction. But then, because of the Depression, and then particularly because of the war, plans to build this space were put on hold. As peace came and people got back to their normal lives, planning for construction began, resulting in the building that we occupy opening in 1951. Trust me, this will eventually get around to Lammas. This building was designed very deliberately, and certain themes run throughout it. For example, the wall behind me. You look at it and you can see that there's a very significant grid pattern evident in the wood. At the same time, if you look over to the windows, you'll see that same grid pattern repeated there. And wouldn't Montgomery Schuyler have loved that window? And if you come into the Mount Curve entrance, there's a wall of concrete blocks, again forming a grid pattern both just outside the main entrance and then carrying on into the building outside the offices. The squares repeated in these features were understood at the time to reflect the rationality of the humanism FUS offers. This building has evolved in the 7+ decades since it opened. For example, the entire north wing, that we usually refer to as the RE wing, is not original to the building. And even the main office itself was added later. And of course, if you've been here a while, you know that we did a fair amount of renovation to this building just a few years ago. A new elevator, new HVAC, completely gender-neutral bathrooms, and an entirely new configuration of rooms on the very lowest floor of the building and of several others down the hallway. This space here, our upper assembly hall, is of course the key space of all in this building, and it too has evolved. You might be surprised to learn that this organ is not original to the building. It was installed about a decade after construction and necessitated a deepening of the stage overall. This half wall to my left was not here. Both there and where the organ is now were essentially permanent backdrops that framed this space. Those sliding doors weren't here either. That doorway was simply open, as was the corresponding doorway across the hall into what we now call the Dietrich room, which was then considered overflow space for this hall. In fact, the pulpit was at that time permanently affixed to the stage at the far end, so it might be more visible over there. Obviously, there had been many audiovisual upgrades. This room itself was designed very intentionally. If you look up, you probably won't need a lot of imagination to realize that this blue ceiling with clear light scattered throughout is intended to evoke the idea of a starry sky. Indeed, when the cove lights are on above and behind me, it has always seemed to me as if it was reminiscent of the light at dusk or at dawn. Looking down, the dark tile floor was intended to symbolize the dark soil of the earth, and out of it, these pews that I'm looking at, and that you're sitting in here today, were designed to mimic wheat stalks growing out of the earth toward the sky. See, I told you we would eventually get back to Lammas. There's something quite magical about the layout here. If you go to many of these other religious communities that I've referred to earlier, just within a few blocks of here, and you go into their main worship spaces, most of them have little natural light and do not have huge, clear windows like we do, for example. True, some may have windows that are significant, but they're often designed with stained glass, for example, to tell a particular religious story. But we have a huge window wall that lets the world come in, and a hall that evokes a Minnesota wheat farm. Rather than embed a narrative in our windows, we find our narrative on either side of ours. When we come together here as humanists, we occupy a space that encourages us to reflect on the natural world, a world of growth, a world of seasonal cycles, and our place in it. This may well be the last Lammas where we gather on our pews that evoke wheat stalks. As you know, beginning last year, a dedicated team of volunteers began engaging our community in a discussion about the future layout of this room, and in particular, on the seating. In other words, we asked ourselves, have we reached a point where we want to replace the pews with something else, like chairs? After an extensive effort to engage our community and a brief and quite successful fundraising campaign, this spring the Board of Trustees voted to move forward with this plan. It's my understanding that once details about the flooring have been resolved, the replacement will begin. Well-respected members of the congregation have expressed concerns about the idea, including objections that to remove these pews, which had been an integral part of this building since the day it opened, and whose wheat-evoking design is a component of this room's overall design, would undermine the integrity of this space and diminish it. As I mentioned earlier, Lammas is a time in our liturgical calendar when we mark the beginning of the harvest season, a time when the fields are cleared. In a sense, to remove these pews with their intended wheat allegory is to engage in a harvest of sorts. We planted these seeds, if you will, 73 springs ago, tended them carefully, and now we have reached the time when we come together in gratitude and clear this, our own field, not simply for the sake of doing so, but in order that a new crop may be planted, a crop we hope will sustain us for many years to come. But hold on, you say. You propose to rip up our wheat and plant a whole new crop altogether. That's not right. Well, I'm very much a city boy, but I would respectfully disagree with the idea that that's not right. Farmers will often rotate their crops because, according to those in the know, this can improve soil quality while getting the most out of the soil to begin with. It can interfere with pests and plant diseases, reducing the need for chemicals to respond to them. And it can promote flexibility and resilience in the face of changing conditions. We will, of course, replant our little indoor field here, and it's not necessary to consider the next crop to be something fundamentally different from the wheat that the original designers of this space imagined. Think of it as simply a new strain of wheat, one which has evolved and which may prove hardier over time as we necessarily encounter changing conditions. We're not suddenly bricking over these windows and retracting our invitation to the world to come in. Our deeply valued connection to that world will be enjoyed in a refreshed, renewed way. But the history major in me rebels. Minneapolis was historically the home to a thriving milling industry, producing flour for the world. We can't turn our backs on that heritage. Well, it's certainly true that wheat was planted in Minnesota from the earliest settler days. And according to the Minnesota Historical Society's online reference, Minnepedia, By 1870, the state had 507 flour mills, most in the southeast. Statewide, farmers grew wheat on more than 61% of cultivated acreage. Not bad. Nonetheless, Minneapolis reports that by the late 1870s, Minnesota's wheat crop had begun to decline. Note that this shift was underway about a decade before the construction of the first Unitarian building downtown. And in a January 1897 address to the Minnesota Historical Society, noted business leader James J. Hill observed this trend and added that farmers around the area, quote, are doing other and better things, unquote, than focusing on wheat. Today, according to the Society, the state's largest agricultural commodities include corn and soybeans, and the state is also a top producer of soybeans, oats, and wild rice. Wheat doesn't seem to be mentioned. And consider the possibility that in the context of greater awareness that we are all on native land, wild rice may indeed be a more appropriate symbolic crop to plant. In the end, it may be more important that there always be growth here, and less important exactly what crop our seeding is thought to represent. This space has been, and will continue to be, one which promotes growth, so long as we keep coming here with our commitment to seek it. What is it they say about reaping what we sow? And as for the flexibility which crop rotation is supposed to support, definitely. This next slide here, showing wheat growing in traditional row patterns, reflects a bit the layout of the room as it originally existed, pews in parallel rows. In fact, the photo is really reminiscent of the original layout of the pews. If you look carefully, you'll see that they're on a bit of a slant. It's, excuse me, initially when they were placed in the building, they were in an unbending parallel configuration like the slide. It's my understanding that to slightly tilt them as they appear today was deeply controversial when it was undertaken a few decades ago. That's what I'm hearing. Sit tight. Nonetheless, this is not the only way to plant. If we turn to our next slide, we're reminded that fields can be laid out in a number of ways to suit our purposes, particularly as those purposes evolve over time. Will this new approach to this space represent a change? Of course. But remember, our congregation grew out of its founder's interest in Henry Martin Simmons' approach to the theories of Charles Darwin. Evolution is a concept deeply embedded in FUS's DNA, and it has been for over 140 years. Darwin would have told you that evolution has not stopped in the world, and it hasn't stopped here either. Simmons indeed anticipated that moments like this might come, even to this congregation where he spent over 20 years of his life. In an essay published in 1904 entitled The Breath of Life, Simmons made a powerful argument in favor of openness to new approaches to spirituality. Writing in the fall, Simmons observed, "The trees these autumn days are shedding their leaves quite freely, and seem to tell the preacher to let old beliefs drop as fast as they die, and not to spend too much of his precious time trying to glue them on. These October maples and mountainsides blazing in a bonfire which goes out to leave them bare till spring brings better, tell religion to drop as fast as they are outgrown, even the forms that have served it best, and to trust the good providence which made them, and which will make more when needed. It is not the leaves of Bibles or of any books, nor, perhaps Simmons might have added, traditional pews, but the breathing of our own thought and love which brings the real spiritual life." It's time, and it'll be okay. The electronic recessed stars above will continue to shine. The world will continue to enter in through these glorious windows. The rich spiritual soil we've been cultivating here for nearly a century and a half will continue to produce abundantly, and new crops of ideas will flourish and sustain us. Even our great detractor, Montgomery Schuyler, looked at our first building and referred to it, and perhaps indirectly to us, as innovative, unconventional, and vigorous. I'm convinced that these adjectives apply to the FUS of our time, just as they did to the FUS of the 1890s. And in the end, it is not how we sit that makes us who we are. It is our individual and collective innovativeness, unconventionality, and vigor which define who we are. It is our steadfast commitment to pursuing a vision of humanism, seen through the lens of Unitarian Universalism, which makes us, us. From the unforeseen beauty and change will come many possibilities for the sort of spiritual growth our third principle urges us to encourage in one another. Perhaps a century from now, our successors will celebrate the changes they have made to this space. Perhaps they will look with pity upon us primitives of the early 21st century, literally looking down on us, next slide please, from their hovering seats, floating up there in all that open space. How they will connect such things to wheat or other crops, I leave to them. Perhaps they'll consider it an advanced form of hydroponics. Whatever happens, I know I will hope that then, as now, and as in Simmons' time, it will be the thoughts and the love and the life that the people of this congregation bring to this or any other future space, which are the true heart of what it means to be a part of First Unitarian Society. The never-ending cycle of the seasons and the ongoing story of this sanctuary is each an overarching narrative, an origin story, a liturgy perhaps, ideas which help inform the character of the community which gathers here, and indeed sustains that community. And it is a privilege and a joy to affirm our connections to both. May it ever be so, and a happy Lammas to you all.